So, how did you get started in the mental skills space?
I think I've mentioned it before, but I have quite an unconventional journey. So I didn't go through the typical psychology sort of way of doing things. Like I never studied psychology, but I've always been involved with sports and probably high performance sports since about 18. So, um, and I was recognizing, when we went to America, I got involved with baseball. It's a long story, but basically, it sort of went back to this sort of pivotal moment, and I've shared it a few times, but I think it's important for me to always revisit. I was at a spring training, must have been 2004 or five, around that sort of period of time, and I was looking over the minor league field. So minor league complex is probably 200 athletes, I think, at that point. So it's a crazy number. And I was talking to one of the coaches, and I asked him, how many of these kids make it to the big leagues? And at that point, I think the draft rate was about 3%. So like 3% of people you draft end up making it. And so, one of the things obviously that hit me back then, which I sort of thought about, but didn't really consider much, is, well, what are we doing for the other 97? Because chances are they'll never fulfill what they hope to when they, were part of a professional baseball. That's a whole nother thing to look at. But then I said, I look across the field, I see everybody looks the same. They're all really, well put together athletes. They seem all very skillful, like they all throw hard and they all hit the ball a long way. What's the difference? And it was sort of a throwaway comment. He said, "Oh, it's the top 2 inches, mate." And I said, "Oh, yeah. How much work do you do on that?" And he said, "None." And that was sort of, can you imagine that collision? So it was like this, and I've talked about it a lot through the years. It's what I call the difference between perceived and actualized value. So the perception is we value the mental side of performance. The reality is we don't. And the way we can measure that, I think, is right through time and resources in an environment. So if you think of an environment, go, yeah, you talk to a coach, and a coach will go, "Oh, the game's 80% mental." And I always go, "No, it's not even close to that." And if it was that, would you then dedicate 80% of your preparation time to training that aspect of your performance? The answer is no. So I think, there is not really a clear value from coaches, but I think you can overvalue it as much as undervalue it. I know that sounds strange, but in overvaluing it, you almost look at this thing as like, here's a silver bullet. Like, if we get this in place, and we're going to be this awesome, amazing team. And that's not true whatsoever. It's part of the performance pillars, but it's not the premier performance pillar.
And why do you think it is that coaches, by and large, say it's so important, yet, from my understanding, what you're saying there as well, by and large, it doesn't have that level of importance when it comes to fitting out a schedule for the week?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a Pandora's box you open there. I think firstly is that a lot of coaches don't know where it fits. And so it's easy to say it's really valuable, but then, it often can be used as a crutch for your underperforming team. Like, hey, we're just not mentally good enough. And so, like, a game that I'm involved with probably the most is combat sports like rugby or evasive sports. And so rugby league, etc. And, you have to be physically and technically good before you even have the mental part of it play a massive difference. Like, sort of a phrase I've used over time is, you can't outthink a bad body or poor skill. And so, like, you think as for most athletes, they have three things that makes them good: is their body, their craft, and their mind. And the first two, to answer your question, is real easy to train. Like, you think about that, like, okay, how do you get your body better? Okay, well, you eat properly, you do the right training protocol, and you're going to improve your physical composition, and then also your physical ability. Like, how do you get your craft better? Well, the areas of your game you need to work on. You can have drills and things like that to help do that. And then you get to the mental side, and, part of my sort of attempt to challenge the current way it's been done is to go, we are way too philosophical and not enough like a tradesman. So that's sort of where I see it being really important is that we can't just have these ideas and research and theories around what happens to people under pressure. We've got to actually have practices and tools and habits that enable them to navigate through pressure. And I think in large, the sports fight world has been way too much on the philosophical side and not enough on the practical side. And so then even if someone could recognize that it's a really important part of performance, what do you do to train it? And how do you then improve someone mentally to perform better under pressure? And without those tools and practices and approaching it like a skill, then it's just going to remain where it is.
Yeah, 100%. Great points. And I've had that twice or three times, young players reaching out to me on Instagram and saying like, oh, I can understand that it's really clear, but I follow this other thing and it's always really complicated. And that's something I found as well when I was young. I was like, I was somewhat interested in this, but it was just too complicated for me to even look at.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't have to be. So, like, what sport have you been involved with the most in your life?
Rugby.
Okay, so this is an easy question then. So, what does a mentally proficient rugby player do well?
What do they do well?
Yeah, like if you look at someone and go, man, they're mentally really good. What is it that they do well?
They play well throughout the 80 minutes, regardless of what has happened or is happening, that they're, you know, whether they're losing, winning, made mistakes, or whatever's happening, they seem to stay at a high level of performance.
So I love that. It's so simple. So they're consistent, they stay present, they make good decisions. So the game gives you clues of what's required to be good at it mentally. And I think that's where we overcomplicate it. Instead of going to the game to offer the clues of what we should be training, we go to a book. And a book might say, here's 9 traits of mentally strong athletes, or, you know, here's 9 traits of high performers. And we go, well, great, but does our sport demand that? And so, you know, I divide sports into 3 categories. So you have one, you have your endurance sports. So they have a whole bunch of mental skills associated with that you need to be able to develop, which is a lot around, you know, resilience and being able to continue through pain and, you know, all of that sort of stuff to deal with the inner voice. And how do you, like I just watched yesterday, the Ironman out of Kona, Hawaii, World Ironman champs, and, you know, this guy won it in under 8 hours. And just, I would have loved to have a recording his inner voice. Imagine that that would have been really interesting, to see what they were going through, what they talk about, how their self-talk changes throughout a race. And so that's skills to me, that's skills. Then you have sports where you initiate movement. So you have sports like your golf and probably a tennis serve. And rugby, there's a couple of activities, so line out throw and goal kickers. And that requires a whole different set of mental skills, because they'll be more about your process and dealing with that gap between, you know, when you get given the ball and then you have to perform your skill. Like there's always a gap. It's not reactive. You have to initiate the movement. So therefore there's room for all sorts of things to go on, which we've seen with line out throwers and goal kickers get the yips, if you want to use that term, is because they haven't managed that external voice in that moment and how to deal with it. And then you get sports, the major part like of rugby, football, I suppose, sports like hockey, basketball would be you respond to movement a lot. So you're not actually thinking through the activity, you're more hoping that you've done. And so you'd force on that would be really good preparation, great decision making. How do you learn well? What pitches do you need to see? Can you learn from the past pitches that you have seen? You know, it's like something like good decision makers are the product of a whole lot of bad decisions often, aren't they? You know, like they've learned from bad decisions over time, they become good. That's a mental skill, which you learn. You're a good learner. You can adjust, you can grow. So, you know, even within that framework there, you can see that there's multiple different skills. And to me, I very much think of it like your body. Like a rugby player trains his body different from a cricketer, from a golfer, you know, from a triathlete. Why? Because the demands of the sport require that they do that. And I just don't know why we don't approach that from the mental aspect very often.
I love the way you break down those three. And one thing interesting with the inner voice one and the kind of
Mm,
endurance, and obviously towards the end of a rugby game that comes in, 70 minutes,
mhm,
75
mhm.
minutes in, and something another thing with training the mind for it, but something I find interesting. I work in a university now, coach in university, and there's a lot of, is it safe sport they call it, about like not about pushing people and about, when is it a coach being, I don't know what the words are, but like, I don't know, is abusive the right word or whatever, but flogging people. And it's something that I remember when I was younger training, just loving that battle with the inner voice, that like, I'm not going to give up, and like, no matter what, I'm not going to give up, and just going and going and going. And I don't know, is there a balance there with like training people to point of breaking so that they can get close to that inner voice and learn how
Yeah,
to deal
yeah,
with
it's
it?
an interesting one, isn't it? We know that one of the most underrated enhancers of our personal well-being is the ability to overcome adversity. So this is part of my frustration with some of the modern well-being initiatives, is that we try to insulate people from adversity, whereas we should be giving them the tools to overcome adversity, because when you do hard things and you overcome them, man, that enhances your well-being massively. So I don't think the it's quite positioned right. Like there's a difference between a coach being an absolute prick and hostile and treating people with disrespect, versus we're going to challenge you today and we're going to help you navigate through this challenge. And if you navigate through this challenge, it's actually going to be a massive enhancer of your well-being, not detrimental to your well-being. And so I think it's the way that we see it. Like it's all about, like the days of yelling someone up a mountain are over, aren't they? Like we know that from our research, we know from practice, we know from feedback that that doesn't work. Um, may work for one or two individuals, but it doesn't work for a collective. And so then we still need people to do difficult things. This is where I think the well-being stuff can get a little bit cloudy for me, like personally. Like you're a professional athlete or you're trying to be at your best, regardless of that. You're going to have to do some really hard things that you don't like, and we're going to have to help you get through those. So to me, to take out the element of adversity in the name of well-being doesn't make sense from my perspective.
Yeah, I fully agree. Like you have to get into those dark places essentially. And like,
Yeah,
like I remember, yeah, just training to a point where you feel like you're going to collapse, but you keep
yeah,
going. And it was so good for me.
yeah. And you think about it, like at the end of a session like that, you look at the man in the mirror and you're proud. Like, how does that not enhance your well-being? Well, I don't get why we would want to shelter people from that.
100%. You start to feel like a savage, you feel like an animal, and then you know what you're
Yeah,
capable of.
yeah. And you can do it without being mean, and you can do it without being without embarrassing people, and you can do it without exposing people and singling out people, and like you can do all of that, really hard work. But I think sometimes we have got the SAS or the special forces model in our mind when we think about doing hard things. And so someone over your shoulder yelling at you, calling you all sorts of things, like that's not really, in my experience, like that's not professional sports at all. So maybe it's an archaic perspective of what something is or isn't that has now probably had the pendulum swing the other way, where there are coaches who are probably scared of placing demands on athletes. And it's interesting. I don't know if you've read it. Like, there's a big discussion now over concussion and safety in our sport. And I read a thing that I think it's John Smith, who's a ex-South African captain, wrote. And I think Bucky's Borthel, which those two might not always be the best examples, but they basically were saying we signed up knowing that our bodies were going to be at risk and that injury was a part of a game. And I get that. What they don't sign up for is reckless behavior, compromising their long-term health. But I think it's a bit like that with our well-being. Like we don't want to make high performance sport a graveyard for young people. We don't want that whatsoever. But I do think we need to also be really clear, like this is hard and it's not for everyone, and it's real difficult. And there is a line between abuse and us demanding that you get the best out of yourself. And I think that line's rather clear, to be honest. I don't think it's that murky at all.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, you said it there, is like, it is hard and it's demanding and not everyone makes it. And like, I don't know, you've probably heard this as well of a generation of everyone getting a gold star or everyone getting a ribbon. And it's something I work with players who are one below the professional level, will say. And, I find it sometimes coaching teams that people expect. And I'll tell you one quick story. This player said, "Oh, I want to be here. I want to get in the team. I want this more than anything. I'm willing to do anything." And I said, "I'm listening." I'm like, "Okay, great. Like, this is exactly what I want to hear from a player." And then I said, "Okay, well, you know her. You see how hard she works. If you work harder than her, you'll get there." And she said, "Well, I'm never going to be able to work that hard."
Mm-hmm.
You
And it's
know,
just that sense of, like as you said, it's a bit like I think what the athletes are most saying is just care for the person as much as you care for the performer. And I think if we got that right, then we get that balance right. Like, so, and I think a common example is in some of our Olympic sports over here where there's been reviews and investigations. And, I think it's happening everywhere in the world. I'm reading about it most weeks, is that the complaints of the athletes is that we didn't feel valued as people. Like, we felt valuable when you're in your program and that we were performing, but soon as that didn't happen, then all of a sudden we're neglected and thrown out the back door, and we've been given nothing to move our lives on with. And you think about that baseball story from the start, right? So what do we do with the other 97%? The least we can do is make sure that we give them some tools for life, right? So they come out of that 3 to 5 year experience, might not have fulfilled their dream, but are really well equipped to be really successful at life.
100%. And what are your thoughts on, say, going all in, being 100% all in when 97% don't make it?
You just don't know until you give it a shot, can't you? Like, you're not going to make it if you're 90% in. So, I mean, you just got to go. It's like, there's a great story that it's not with sport, with a mountaineering with Sir Edmund Hillary. And of course, we know Sir Ed well from our history. And he was told that there is no guarantee that your supplemental oxygen will be enough for you after 28,500 feet. Like, we know that it works up to them, but after that, we don't know. So the name, the Death Zone, literally came from that concept, but Everest is 29,000 feet. And so I know Sir Ed would have had a choice at some point to go, do I stop or do I keep going? And like, what he was putting at risk was much more than any of us put at risk. It was his own life. But you can imagine probably there's this inner dialogue as saying, I would rather fail from courage than succeed from fear. That's how I imagine. And, like, it's the thing about being all in, it takes tremendous amount of courage because there's nowhere to hide if you don't make it. So it's easier, like, I talk about it when I, work with athletes, talk about front loading a lot. And so many athletes front load with excuses before a performance so they can avoid judgment, and it justifies underperforming. And so it's actually so courageous to go, listen, I'm all in, and my all in is everything. And if it's not enough, I can still look at the man or the woman in the mirror and be proud of that, rather than always have a 5% in reserve that I hold as something that I'm not quite able to give, but it allows me to get off the hot seat of actually wondering whether I'm good enough or not. And that's a hard world to live in.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. And I think that, like, the plan B, having a backup plan, it kills you because you're giving energy towards it. And it's like you say, it's giving yourself a way to fail. Whereas when you take away that option to fail and you have no option but to fail, the strength and the focus and the energy you get towards the plan A is incredible.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever watched Shark Tank, which is like those.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you learn from that is that they'll never invest into an entrepreneur who already has a job. Like they're like,
Yeah.
nah, quit your job, do this full time, and then we'll invest into you because we just don't believe you'll be all in if you have other options. Now, we have to work through that with it's a case by case. But I think I know lots of athletes who have been all in, didn't make it, love the experience, learn a ton. 25, 26, life's not over, and I think there's a bit of a myth there, maybe that hey, you've got to get all this stuff behind you because at 25, 26, if you got nothing but your professional sports experience, you're behind. I don't think they're behind at all. I think they're probably ahead.
100%. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what I heard. And something that held me back, I think, is people saying
Mm.
like, "Oh, keep one eye on the career. The rugby won't last
Yeah,
forever. What if you get injured?" And I did keep one eye on both, and to my detriment. And then I remember I have a younger brother, and I remember saying to him, "No, go after it. Just go after it.
yeah,
Get a degree along the way because
yeah,
he's intelligent enough to do that. But don't be thinking about getting a job.
yeah,
Don't be thinking
yeah.
about
And,
that."
and what I think we confuse it with, which I think we do a much better job, there's a difference between the discussion around your career and then the discussion around your identity. And I think they're two different conversations. So a discussion around your career might be, hey, I'm comfortable at 25. If I don't make it, I'm going to give this 5 years shot to start uni. And, I might have to live with mum and dad and it might be a bit, on the bones of my bum, but so be it. That's a different discussion to I ended the game at 25. I didn't find out who I was outside of rugby. And when you took rugby away, I had nothing. Now that's a dangerous space to live. But it's not the same conversation of whether you should choose pursuing a sport over pursuing a career. This is around your identity, which is completely different discussion. And I think we've confused those at points, and we've watched people who have come out of the back end of their careers with no sense of identity outside of the sport. And then they equate that with they didn't have good career planning. No, it had nothing to do with career planning. It was more how they viewed themselves and the sport they played and their inability to separate the person and the performer. And then when you took the thing away that had way too much attachment to their own personal identity and well-being and sense of self-esteem, then of course they were going to be lost. But that's not because they had bad career options.
Fully
Completely
agree.
different.
Yeah, because anybody retiring from rugby at 25 or 35 who's given it everything and who's been involved in a high performance environment, they don't have nothing. They have so
Yeah.
much. Like they've so
Yep.
many skills, so much experience compared to many other people those ages. So
Yeah. But when you wake up in the morning, and if you've sort of gone through the lens of, what's my purpose in life, what makes me successful, what makes me feel proud of myself, and you've answered every one of them by your sport, then you take that away. That's where the danger, I think, begins to happen.
yeah, and how do you help players with their identity and being other than a rugby player?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the way I've described it is that rugby doesn't define your identity, okay, but it's the canvas that you have at this part of your life to express it. So you have to do, if you haven't done your own personal identity work, then the vacuum of that vacuum will be filled with whatever you're involved with. So whether you're doing real estate or whether, you're a doctor, it doesn't matter. Like whatever you're involved with will fill that vacuum if you haven't done your own work. And so, I'll often ask them to do a bit of their own work around, well, who are you? And what does it mean to be like, it's sort of the process I go with is know yourself, be yourself, stay yourself. That's so if you know who you are, what does that look like on a field? And how do you maintain authenticity to that? So the sport should just be an extension of our identity, not the place that we grab our identity. And then sort of to monitor that, I would look at three things for a player, like post performance, like 24 hours after a game, is your mood, self-esteem, and relationships impacted by your performance? And if the answer is yes, then we got to have a chat because you got way too much power associated with too much attachment to the sport and to who you are as an athlete that's dominating way too much of how you view yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the identity is so important. And to be honest, something I learned a lot about myself when I went through a tough time and thought I'd stop playing with injuries. But I think a big part of it as well, growing up, is that you're forced to not express your identity when you're playing. So when I was
Yeah.
anyway, when I was growing up in different rep environments, like you couldn't, if you wore a certain color boots, you'd get
Mm-hmm.
sledged. If you, like, I see now one or two super
Thank God
rugby.
those days are over.
Yeah, but I see,
Yeah.
I don't know his name, but like a super rugby player who paints his nails, and then other guys with
Oh,
color.
Naitoa, he plays for us, Chief Naitoa.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and like
Yeah.
other people with color in their hair and different
Yeah.
things, and they're expressing their identity. So it's something that
Mm,
when you're talking there, like when I was growing up, you weren't able to express any part of your identity. You had
mm,
to just conform. That's the way I felt anyway, or what I found. And so then you're conforming all the time, and
mm.
you kind of don't know who you are, or maybe you have an idea, but you don't become aware of that. So then that's an issue.
I think it's a challenge, isn't there? A fine line between expression and narcissism. I think there's quite a fine line between that. And I think that's an internal conversation, like I can understand it from a collective. So we have a collective identity as a team, right? And then you have individuals who need to express their own identity within that collective space. But the collective should always override the individual, for teams to be healthy. So what I mean by that is that we understand that there are certain behaviors and expectations in any environment we're in, and we respect that environment enough not to be someone we're not, but to be able to have I suppose, what would be the word, have a filter through which we express ourselves through. And so, like you put yourself into a male dominated rugby environment, and then you might go like I have in the past, I've gone my wife to a cooking school. Now I can express my authenticity in both of those settings, but it's going to look different. And so I think that's the wisdom aspect of it. Like, it's not, I think sometimes we confuse it. We just express ourselves equal. We can do what we want. But I'm a dad and a husband and a son and a brother. I have to consider all of the impact of my expression on those relationships to make sure that in the name of personal autonomy, I'm not damaging the collective, right? So there is a real way we have to work through that. Because if we just said everyone do what you want when you want, express yourself, and you don't have collective values, then we have no alignment, we have no unity, and it's just it's Lord of the Flies basically.
Yeah,
So it's probably finding that.
yeah, for sure. And so, yeah, with like wearing gear, like wearing the right stuff, showing up on
Yeah,
time, all that,
yeah.
like, and so do you go through kind of what, like kind of not terms or different things that show that you're staying in line with the group?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have our standards, which are all the standards are the ability to translate our values into actions. That's all they are. So we can have a way to measure if we're being authentic. Like if we say, one of our values is we want to play with freedom, and we find out we kick 80% of our ball away, then we go, well, those behaviors don't line up with our values. So we're going to have to change our behaviors. So I think behaviors or standards or whatever it is are critical to, one, bring alignment so everybody understands how we can walk together. Because imagine trying to herd 36 or 38 young men. You got to have something, some guidelines. Okay, we turn up at this time, we wear this, and that's not taking away anybody's individual freedom. It's putting it's almost like putting a break on the idea that individual freedom equals I do what I want. Individual freedom can only be expressed healthily within the context of community, right? And so we don't try to say you just go do what you want. You express who you are, but here's the boundary. Here's the boundary. Like this is what we're trying to do together. So the moment your individual freedom compromises the collective goal, then your belonging to the group is compromised.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
that's
for
why it's
sure.
important we have standards.
Yeah, you give people the parameters by which to express
Yeah.
themselves, but yeah, they understand the parameters.
Yep. Yeah. And most people who, particularly in the world that we live in with high performance sport, they get that.
Yeah.
So they get the idea, like, I just can't go and drink 3 nights a week in the name of freedom and wear what I want and show up late. Like, yeah, you can do that, but you won't last here. So they understand. Everybody understands. Every place of community that we have, every team that we're a part of, has to have collective standards and ideals and values to be able to be effective in the way that they function together.
Mm. What's the biggest challenge that players come to you with, or say the most common?
I think just the fear of being judged. Yeah. I still think that's probably the premier one of all of our experience. So going back to our, we were talking before about Owen Eastwood and belonging, he sort of, really does a masterful job of unpacking why belonging is central to the human experience, right? And so, and then the antithesis of belonging is isolation or rejection or separation, whatever term you want to use for that. So, when someone plays, their judgment, someone's going to make a judgment call over their performance, and that judgment could result in them being isolated from the group. So always joke, like, our players are more nervous before a Bronco than they are before a Super Rugby final. Like, if they got to do testing, like a yo-yo test or a Bronco test, or like, they tend to be more nervous about that than they are about playing and, playing the biggest games. And I think what it is that at the end of the day, a test you can't hide from, like, just, it is what it is. And the number is the number. And so it either tells you whether you're good enough or not good enough, whether you've done the work or haven't done the work. And also people recognize that not doing well on those tests could have potential impact over whether I belong to this group or not. Because, I think we all understand the teams that we function in don't have unconditional belonging, even though we'd love to say that. We like these terms like family, which is just not a right term for our work. It's family is probably our immediate family, whether we like it or not, is probably where we do have an unconditional belonging. Like, there's probably nothing I can do that would compromise my relationship with my family. Like, they could say, you're an idiot, you need to do but at the end of the day, it's my place of, I walk in, tonight at the end of my day, whether I performed or not at work doesn't affect my sense of belonging to my family. Now, in sports, whether you perform or not is why you belong. No, that's the wrong way of saying it. It was how you belong. So you're there because of your performance. We take your performance away, you might not be here anymore because it's not a social club. And I think those things colliding within someone is like, am I going to be good enough? It's really important that I belong here. What could create isolation and rejection is underperformance. So if I don't perform well, then I don't belong here. And that cascade, I suppose, of thought processes then, eventuate in someone thinking, or someone saying to someone, you're not good enough. And that's, I reckon, still the hardest thing for any of us, one, to hear. Like, I'm 46 years old, mate. If someone tells me I'm not good enough, it still hurts.
Yeah, big time. And great points there. And it's a real paradox, because the more you worry about those things, the worse you play, the worse you perform.
Yeah. I mean, it's, we talk about it a lot of, like, how do we help our athletes, be completely focused on what's in front of them. We know that the best version of anyone is the one that's fully present. Like, we know that, right? So the more present you are and I am, say, in this conversation, the better the conversation is, and the more our authenticity shines through. But if I was, like, massively distracted by the NFL, which I'm not, I'm trying not to be, or, you were distracted by something else, then we know our performance reduces, right? So my equation for high performance is it's capability, so what you're capable of, minus interference. And so we know that, for most people, we're increasing capability all the time. Like, that's what we want to do all the time, increase capability, particularly with younger athletes, right? And once they get near that top of echelon, then we can go, okay, we might want to deal a bit more with the interference factors. So we know that something like keeping someone present is how we get the best expression of them, they begin to do that. But what keeps them from that is when this external noise around, say, consequences or judgment or expectation, whatever it is, begins to get loud in their life, right? And then they begin to, at times, manipulate their behavior to what they think is needed to belong, rather than just trust their authenticity and belong through them. Then all of a sudden you're managing social and performance issues, not just concentrating on what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And are there any things in particular that you use to help players to minimize those distractions, we'll say, or the things that get in the way of expressing your full capability?
Yeah, I think it depending on the situations and depending on the sport. So like a slower moving sport. I've done a lot of work obviously in cricket and baseball. And so they're two sports where I'd have a little bit of a process. Let's call it ACT. So before an at bat, or before a pitch, or if you're about to pitch, or if you're a batsman before you face your first delivery, or maybe once every 3 or 4 balls. ACT is it's in very, very simple process. So it's assess the situation, commit to a plan, trust your skill set. So that's a really simple tool I use all the time, because it just enables players to it's a vehicle to get them present. Does that make sense? Like, it's not a magical equation. All it does, I know if they have to think through those 3 things, they're going to be much more aware of what's required of them in the task that they're about to engage with. If they don't have a process, their mind can just wander, so it's kind of just bringing them back into, and then I suppose in the more of the fast moving sports. So rugby's a bit different now. So many stoppages. I think a few of our players use that tool. It might just be around one key phrase on attack and D. So, it might be come up square. That might be something on D, or see the whole picture might be something on attack. Like if player finds himself getting really narrow, like I call it portrait versus landscape mode, really narrow versus really wide. And, I know in football in particular, in the UK, there's a lot of talk about scanning and that. And, I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about more of a spatial awareness that is more of a mental thing rather than a gameplay thing. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to have them scan this whole brilliant pitch. I'm trying to have them be aware that there's more going on than what they see, and just to be open to that, I suppose, in the moment, rather than to be predetermined and closed off.
100%, yeah. And that kind of portrait landscape, even just that mental switch to go to a landscape, would relieve some anxiety in that.
Huge amount.
Yeah, if you're thinking portrait, and I know exactly what you're saying, as you're saying it, you're too narrowed in. Whereas if you just go landscape, you relax.
So Andrew Huberman talks about it a lot, who's I think one of the leading neuroscientists I think he's out of Stanford, and he talks a lot about like the relief of stress by going wide and doing scans of the horizon, versus being really narrow and focused. And I think there's a lot of, so when we talk about, it's ironic, we'll tell our players to focus and they hear that as go narrow.
Yeah.
We shouldn't say that. We should say stay wide and focus, like be aware. So in rugby, the phrase that I've used is commit to the system, but adjust to the picture. So you can probably understand that as we still want players deeply committed to the system, but have the ability to adjust to the picture that's in front of them at any moment.
Yeah. It's interesting there when you say telling players to focus, and that would just create anxiety as well, or I think,
because the definition of focus is like, that's not focus.
No.
Yeah, that's just overstimulated by something.
Yeah, you should probably be giving them tools to become present, because if you're as a coach, you're telling a player to focus, you're identifying that they're not present in the moment. So in fact, what you actually want them to do is to be more present. Yeah,
and like you'll hear a coach saying, the team is up by say 15 in the second half and they end up losing or something like that, which happens all the time. It's like we lost focus. Well, what do you mean? Like, I wouldn't say you lost focus. You just got focused on the wrong things. So all of a sudden now we got focused on scoreboard, or we got focused on time rather than tasks. So, and then that was detrimental impact on our performance, which happens, I think, all the time. Like, I think there's a stat that I had a look from Super Rugby last year. Like, if you went up in the second half by 10 to 14 points in a Super Rugby game in New Zealand, that lead got reduced to 3, like 7 times out of 10. Because the team in front maybe got a little tighter and the team behind maybe got looser. And all of a sudden, the game's changed, and the coach will come out afterwards, and not our coach, who's really quite good in the mental side, like he really gets it. But I've heard coaches come in and say, we just need to be more focused. And I was like, that's the worst thing. Like, what, more stressed? Because that's what people often associate focus with stress, right? And so, no, we just need to be more present and more aware and less distracted.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's when you're mentioning those scenarios, I know that the second you have a lead in a game and you look at the clock and think about running down a clock, you tighten up, you're dust, you can't play.
Yeah, there's 2 things in a rugby game. There's 2 things that create pressure, which is time and score. So you take those out of it, then, so why isn't there pressure on at minute 4? Because time and score is not usually a factor. Why is there pressure at minute 78? Because time and score is now a factor. And time and score are what determine outcome. And so outcome pressure, we have to, like, we have to navigate through outcome pressure. Can't avoid it. I hate the idea that you should just focus on the process and ignore the outcome. I just think it's totally unhelpful, because it's not how we function. Like, we should be, outcome aware, but, task focused. But we have to be aware of the outcome, because sometimes the game is giving us clues about how we should behave in any certain moment. Like, like if it's 21-19 with 30 seconds left on the clock, and you've got a line out and you just need to secure the line out, roll through a couple of phases and kick the ball out and win. That's not your behavior or process at minute 38. Because why? Because the outcome is determined that you behave in certain ways. So, I think sometimes we get so process focused, we become very poor assessors of what's required in a game, because we need to make adjustments all the time.
Yeah, I like that. And so, is that how you would encourage players to be, is outcome aware, but process driven?
That's exactly the language I use. So you've got to be outcome aware. You got to be score aware. You've got to be time aware. Like, I think, because your decisions, once again, going back to that statement before, the game gives you clues. So the game will tell you what you need to do if you're listening or watching. So when you're, as a fan, when you watch a game at minute 76, you know what your team needs to do to be able to win. They know that. Just, can they do it? But if you're so process driven, like, and over process focused, then you don't pick up the clues. And I know that probably sounds a little bit contrary to what so many people in my position teach, but I've watched so many teams not recognize the clues, or not recognize the shifts, or not recognize that, like in baseball, for example, like, you could have this plan and a process. Like, we're coming up against the Mariners. The Mariners are a really patient team. They don't swing at a lot of first pitches. Here's all the analytics. We can sort of pound the strike zone early, get ahead of hitters. That's our plan. First 3 hitters, bang, bang at first pitch. What are you going to do? Oh, well, the process said, no. You need to stop. They've changed their approach. Can you recognize that? Does that make sense? Like,
100%. Yeah, 100%.
And I don't think we always have mentally flexible athletes, because in the name of process, they've actually misread what's demanded of them.
100%. And there's so many ways that plays out. Like, a 10 will be getting the feel of a game towards the second half, and we'll just start kicking more, kicking corners versus going through the hands. And it's not it's not that they're playing on the back foot, but they're just getting, the scoreboard is going in their favor and they're going to kick a
Yeah.
corner to put a little bit more pressure on.
They've recognized the clues.
Yeah.
And they've picked up on them and said, listen, if we do this, we know that if a team is behind and you pin them in their own half and they try to play out of their own half, 9 times out of 10, you're going to come up on top.
Yeah. I think a big part of what would hold people back from going into that space is the fear of the scoreboard or being afraid of failing. It's easy to just focus on the process and block out score altogether. But I suppose it takes more courage to go into that zone where you're like, it's what the best tens do. Like that example, they're fully in tune with the score and they're playing in that space.
Yeah. Well, and I think we try to put process against outcome or performance, but I think they flow together. So the evidence of a good process is good performance. So if you say I'm committed to your process, but you're not performing, I'd say you got a really rubbish process. So all your processes is a set of behaviors that you believe are critical for you to perform at your best. That's all a process is. So if we do A, B, and C, this gives us the best opportunity to perform. So if you keep on doing stuff and your performance isn't getting better, and I call it process apathy, like I find athletes get locked into a process, but it's just something they can hide behind, because a process, you can always project a process. So when do you measure the effectiveness of a process? Some athletes will say, listen, this is my process. I'm just committing it till I have success. And you can't really argue with that because there's no inline for the evaluation of their process. And so I think we have to bring it forward, and challenge the athletes, like, yes, you have a process. Yes, you're committed to it. Yes, you believe these behaviors are critical, but it's not translating to performance. So I would question whether you're working on the right things.
Yeah. And how do you quantify it for players? So would you look at, because say looking at like tackles per game or pass completion or these different things, if you look solely at those as well, you can get skewed and, there can be an error there. If you look at pass completion, someone cannot pass and do one pass and then they have 100% passing. Or how do you determine or put markers in to see if a player their process is working and they are getting better?
Well, I think, collectively and individually, I think we can ask or set a benchmark of, when you are at your best, what are you doing? Yeah. So I think they know that, as far as in preparation, what are you doing? And I've often found with people that are really have performed well and they have a bit of a dip, it's normally not ever adding new things to their process. It's returning and asking them whether the things that they've done in the past that have made them perform well, they're still doing with the same level of engagement and intent as they did previously. So, it's a difference between searching and adjusting, right? So experienced players will make adjustments to their processes because they understand the foundations are really, really strong and they know what to do. Often inexperienced players will just blow up the whole thing and start again. And they're searching, they're looking for something like little silver bullets along the way that can help them play well that week. Whereas your more experienced athletes understand, when I'm at my best and when I have played at my best, and then teams collectively, so you have a look like a team. We have obviously a lot of respect for the Crusaders. When they're at their best, their set piece is dominant. They play a really good territory game and the defense is awesome. When we're at our best, Chiefs, we're playing ball, and we're still doing the other stuff well. We've got a great set piece and got a pretty incredible forward pack. But if that's our foundations. So we know our identity is different from, say, the Crusaders, which is different from the Canes or the Blues or the Highlanders. And so I think we all understand what those trademarks are and what they look like. And then it's making sure that we're doing what we've done when we we did feel like we're at our best. And I reckon just human nature is to take the foot off the pedal quite often and then just return back to that.
Yeah. And then with individual players, like for that's a team collective, but individual players. I think everyone knows like being in the zone or the flow state or whatever you
Mm,
want to call it when
mm.
you're doing your thing, whatever
Yep.
that is. And
Yep.
it's having awareness of that, isn't it? And then understanding what has gotten in the way of me be
Mm.
getting into that space.
And then it's like you have your performers like I think like Richie McCaw and like Sam Kane are quite, obviously Richie and Sam are different players, but have a similar, like you'll never get a 9 one week and a 1 the next week.
No.
It's always a 7 or 8. And you just get that week after week after week. And they're probably the players that don't get as much fanfare or might not get as much admiration because you're just used to them being consistently good. But what I think separates them, and going back to what you're saying, like when I think about a typical athlete's performance over a year, I reckon they have, I call it A, B, and C game. So A game is zone, right? And I reckon that's about 20% of your games, maybe. B game is you're not quite right, but it's not awful. And I reckon that's about 70%. And I reckon there's about 10% of the games your C game, you just don't want to be there and nothing's going right. And so what makes the great players, and I say this, and there's not many of them, is that they, even when they like have something like a B game, they know how to compete and get the best out of themselves that day. They don't have to be in the zone to play well. And this is where the consistency factor comes in, is that they're able to take a day where a normal player would operate at about a 5 and they turn it into a 7 by just competing and just doing what they can. Or they might have a 3 day, but they turn it into a 6 and you go, oh, they weren't at their best, but they certainly didn't throw out a 2 or a 3 for us either. And so, I think that comes with experience and self-awareness and understanding, I think acceptance that you're not going to be at your best every time you walk out onto a paddock. So you've got to have some things in place if you're not at your best, whether it's your body or, simple things. You had a big argument with the missus like the morning of the game, or, you've got someone who's sick in your family, or you've got a niggling injury, or you're worried about All Black selection. All of those things play in. And I think the really good players can navigate through those things and still perform.
Yeah, 100%. I remember playing Gaelic football growing up, different Irish sport, but a coach said before as well, if you're not having a bad game, you can still run around a lot and try and make tackles, and just
it's the effort
be an
stuff.
energy.
Yeah. And I know like I play quite a bit of golf and have worked with quite a few golfers, and like they will narrow it down to simply as, where's the target? How do I get the ball in the hole when they're not feeling good? It's just a simple, really, like little focus. Let's go. Where's my target? How do I get the ball in the hole? And that's about as complicated as my process is going to get today, because I don't have it.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one,
100%. Yeah. And just thanks for your time. But one other one on that, sometimes like what will stop you from getting into that A is if you're in the B and you've had 2 or 3 B games and you're like, all right, I'm doing well and I'm 7 out of 10, but I want to be a 9 out of 10. I want a 10. Is forcing it and just having a conversation with a player recently. Was just talking a little bit about, them moving the ball, not trying to make line breaks every time. And I was just having a conversation around this, and they said, yeah, I used to play a lot of soccer growing up, and my coach used to always tell me, let the ball do the work. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's kind of an interesting paradox again of how you get to that peak state, that A game.
Yeah, and I think it's just like unraveling that with players, right? Understanding why that's the case. So for some players, it will be an external factor, like they want to get a contract and they're not going to get a contract passing the ball in their eyes. So, like there's always ego involved with high performance or any level of performance, because it's the nature of the people involved to have you got to have a little bit of probably moxie about you. I know it's a strange term, but something about you where you will do whatever it takes to get the job done. And there is an ego with that. Don't get me wrong, no matter who you are. And, that's often what then drives sort of probably the dysfunctional behaviors on the field, is that You know, there's so much going on around, you know, and I talk to players, you find this, I talk to players and think, you ask them, do you think everybody watches you when you play? And they'll be like, yeah. You talk to coaches and fans, do you watch number 12 when they play? No, just watch the game. You know, like it might be a bit more direct at our level because you might have a line coach who's really specific around watching what they do on every play. And I know like Wayne Smith used to select players by going to trials and he wouldn't even watch the game. He'd just watch one individual. But for the most cases, like, you know, it's like anything we do in life, you walk through a mall, you think everyone's looking at you. No one's looking at you. Like no one even cares.
Yeah.
You know, so there is definitely an ego, fear, all that stuff that's always riding around with people.
100% is so true. Two things on that. Yeah, I had a conversation with players well 2 or 3 months ago, and I said to them, I was like, half the time I'm the attack coach. I was like, half the time or a good part of the time I'm looking at the defense. Then I'm looking at off the ball. I'm looking at our positioning. I'm looking at our space well across the field. I'm not always looking at the ball, you know, and they're like, oh,
yeah,
you know, mind blown.
yeah. They just think it's that the whole world is watching them play.
Yeah. And another good one on the ego thing. What I love, I heard a while back, Israel Adesanya, another Kiwi, but he said, I'm the shit, but I ain't shit.
Yeah.
And that I think kind of encapsulates what you're saying there, but you need to have something about you, but to be able to suppress that as well, or to not be hung up on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that whole thing of that inner belief and inner confidence versus arrogance. Like, I think when you have true inner belief, no one needs to know how good you are. When you have arrogance, you feel like everybody needs to know how good you are. And so, you know, like Israel is such a lightning rod here in New Zealand because we suffer from the very thing that he's confronting, which is our lack of belief in ourselves, which translates into the tall poppy syndrome and you can't be different. You have to, you know, just put your head down, work hard, and don't stick out. You know, that's the Kiwi Aussie way.
Irish.
Probably definitely the Irish way as well. And I think it's probably a trait of some of our, you know, definitely not North American trait, but probably the trait of some of the Anglo-Saxon, you know, countries has been around that. And so, you know, when Israel, like he did this amazing speech at one of our Halberg Awards, which is our biggest sporting awards of the year. And he just sort of said, when I shine, you all shine. And it was like this confronting moment for the public because, you know, this mostly white little nation who's been, and now you've got this African Kiwi who just behaves differently, who has utter belief, who loves hip hop, who's just himself. And I think it's brilliant because it confronts all our prejudices about what a high performing Kiwi should look like. And, you know, there's probably things that as a Kiwi, I go, that probably doesn't always capture our identity. But I love the fact that he's, you know, like the best one for me, I don't know if you've ever seen interviews with Steven Adams.
No.
He plays for the Oklahoma Thunder. He's a Kiwi. Just go have a look.
Yeah.
Probably the most hilarious things you'll ever see because he is so Kiwi and just himself, and it's hilarious. And, you know, so you've got these figures that are awesome, just challenging our stereotypes, which I think's really, really healthy. And at the same time, not denying the fact we'll probably always be a bit of a conservative sort of, you know, keep to yourself, don't show off. They were the messages that I had growing up. I still think that'll be part of our culture. And I think that's not a bad thing. There's some good aspects to that.
Yeah, it's funny. It just on that, the exact same thing happened in Ireland when McGregor was rising.
Yeah.
And so when he got the money after that, he changed for sure. And people can say what they want about him now. But when he was on his way up, there was a classist thing as well, because he was from a very working class background.
Yeah.
And I loved him.
Was he from a traveling family?
Not quite, no.
Not
but,
quite.
But he was, no, but
because Fury's from that age, like Tyson Fury.
Fury's an actual gypsy and traveler. And but McGregor is not, but just very working class. And I remember when he was rising up, I loved him because he had something that no one else had, and he had that confidence and belief. And I could see the way he talked. He believed fully in what he was saying. Whereas And I loved it and I was endeared to it. And then I remember hearing other friends and older people, especially, being like, oh, that dickhead, that whatever, he just
Yeah.
talks too much. I hate the way he talks. I hate the way he's always talking. Just get in the ring and get on with it, And that, like you're saying,
Yeah.
and everyone in Ireland, I would say 80% of Irish people disliked him, to be honest.
Mm.
And I went to the States in 2016. Every single person I talked to, oh, you're Irish, McGregor, what a legend. I love him. He's incredible. That they
Mm.
love somebody who's confident in
And maybe
themselves.
that's the difference, like, is where these guys get off track is confidence is that I have utter belief in my ability and how great I could be. Arrogance is I need you to acknowledge that.
That's where, I think
You know,
after that, when he won the 2 belts and he got the money, then that's I think that change happened.
Yeah. I mean, I look at it from like I was, in baseball for a lot of years, and you had someone like Derek Jeter, who just treated everyone beautifully. Like there wasn't anyone who had a bad word about Derek Jeter in the way, like, but highly confident, but would never ever be accused of arrogance. Because I think I don't know what I'm trying to say is I think that the gap between confidence and arrogance is entitlement. Like that's where, to me, that's where the bridge, you walk over that bridge called entitlement, and now you've gone from being confident and having self-belief into arrogance and demanding. And the entitlement is that I need everybody to acknowledge the greatness that I see about myself. And, like that to me is where it gets messy for people.
100%. That's brilliantly put there. Well, hey, Aaron, thanks so much for your time.
Hey,
Greatly
mate, no
appreciate it.
worries. Yeah. And thanks for reaching out. It's been excellent.
No, cheers. And you people can find you Twitter, LinkedIn.
Twitter.
That's where I see a lot of your stuff.
Twitter, LinkedIn. Yeah. I just I find something interesting, or if I think about something interesting, then I just share it. Like I don't really have a strategy. Someone asked me the other day, what's your social media person? What do they do? And I was like, one, it's me. And two, if I think it's interesting, I'll post it. So I might have weeks without posting anything, and then I might post a whole bunch of stuff in 3 days because I've got something that I find interesting. So, my philosophy is that, the more you share, the more it forces you to grow. And, I think, people have asked, are you worried about, your IP being out there? And I'm like, no, not at all. One, it's probably not mine. Like it's like a rainbow now of information throughout the years, and we all get stuff off each other. And then secondly, it's one thing to know it, but I don't think you could execute it. So, like there's no danger. I mean, I think it was Padraig Harrington. He had a Bob Rotella book called The Inner Game of Golf or something like that. And it wasn't The Inner Game, it was like one of the Rotella books. And he gave it away to like 5 of his mates on tour, and Rotella said to Padraig, he said, are you worried about them having this information? He goes, no, they won't know how to apply it like I can.
Yeah.
So I think that's the key. Like, yes, you can give away information, but the magic is in the application, and that takes experience and skill. But if it can help people begin to think about those things, and hopefully that's helpful.
100%. Yeah, I love that. And another one I heard before, which is so true, is that nobody can be better at being you than you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Now I can give you a whole framework for a program that I might develop and run, but you've still got to execute it. And that's like developing the programs 20%, executing it's 80%.
Yeah.
So I'm not too worried.
100%. We'll keep up the great work. Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, mate.